What the scariest true story you know? The story of the Lake Niace disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. The Nutty Putty cave incident. A spelunker got stuck upside down in a narrow cave for 26 hours. Crews tried to pull him out with pulleys, but had to be careful not to break his legs, because that could be fatal with the circumstances he was in. Rescuers even almost dislodged him, only for an anchor to fail at the last second, plunging him back into the crevice. He eventually died, and they sealed the cave shut with him inside. I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor, and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid. 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it, and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down. You know that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids? It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva, and within 2 days the wound closed, and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos from this case for those interested. TLDR, patient had a bug lay an egg in her eyelid, and I removed the larva. A guy in a sinking ship found an oxygen bubble and only drank a sip of Diet Coke every 7 hours. He was rescued after 60 hours, after being under constant danger from drowning and even sharks. The story of James Kloss is terrifying. In rural Wisconsin last year, a 14-ish-year-old girl went missing after her parents were murdered in their home. Police arrived within 4 minutes or so, but she is just gone. Of course, speculation is that she was kidnapped, or that she was in on it, or dead, or whatever. Nobody knows because she has completely vanished. 88 days later, in dead of a northern Wisconsin winter, she runs out into the street to a woman walking her dog. She had been held captive about 40 minutes from her home. All of that is scary enough, but here's the terrifying part. She had never had any contact with the guy that murdered her family and abducted her. One day he was driving to a new job, at which he only lasted a day, and saw her get on the school bus. At that moment he decided that he was going to take her. There was no warning. No grooming. There was absolutely nothing that she or her family could have done to avoid everything. A creepy young man saw her from 100 foot away and decided that he would murder her family and take her for himself. The murder of the Grooming family. A deranged pedo named Joseph Edward Duncan was already on the run from the cops for a past sexual assault. He was incredibly charming and manipulative, and was truly pure evil. He camped outside a family's rural home, unseen by them. He picked it out after driving past it and seeing children's toys outside. He watched them from afar, got to know their routine with the intent of kidnapping the children. 10-year-old Dylan, 8-year-old Shasta. Found the lock on the door was broken, entered the home in the middle of the night, and tied up the mom, dad and teenage son. He put Shasta and Dylan in his car, and killed the rest of the family with a hammer. He traveled around various campsites and cabins with Shasta and Dylan captive, sexually abusing, torturing, and raping them. He eventually shot Dylan, but Shasta talked him out of killing her. Jed ended up telling her she taught him how to love. The scariest part is a CCTV footage of Jed and Shasta at a gas station. Cause you could easily believe they were just a normal dad and a grumpy daughter, if you were an onlooker. Eventually, he took her to a diner, where he was finally apprehended, when a waitress noticed something was up, and Shasta was saved after 7 weeks in his clutches. He was dragged away, He called to her, "Promise me you'll visit me in prison," and she said she would. I don't know if she ever did. Jed was put on death row and found to be guilty of 3 previous child murders. He died a few months ago from cancer. But the worst part of it all is how horrible Shasta's life has been afterwards. Drug addiction, in and out of jail, losing her children, etc. Just the most horrifying story ever. Alison Botha. On December 18, 1994, Port Elizabeth resident Alison Botha was abducted, raped, stabbed and left for dead by Frans du Toitenthuns Kruger. Slashed her throat 17 times, so deep she had to hold her own head on as she crawled to the road for help. With her other hand she had to hold in the organ spilling from her stomach. She had been stabbed more than 30 times. By some miracle the knife thrusts had missed her main arteries, so she did not bleed to death and was able to breathe through her severed trachea. There is a documentary that is on Amazon Prime called Alison. Worth the watch, but might be traumatic for some viewers. Trailer for Alison. In 1949, Timothy Evans was wrongly executed for murdering his pregnant wife and daughter. The actual murderer, John Christie, was a prosecution witness at Evans' trial. After Evans was executed, Christie went on to kill 4 more people. Had the police handled the forensic evidence properly, Christie would have been caught when they were investigating Evans, and those 4 people would still be alive. The government didn't acknowledge that Evans was innocent until 2004. The Rian American story. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s, got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years and none of the various owners opened it due to the weight. Finally one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it, he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him, after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA. Blader's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. I don't know if it's scary, but when I was younger, me and my twin brother would help our friend do his paper route. One summer we could smell something gross coming from one of the houses. We all didn't think anything of it until 3 days later, when the smell was reaching down the driveway. He went to the back door where he normally dropped the paper and noticed it was open. We went in and looked around the house and found the owner dead. He had died of a heart attack and his cats were eating him. Joseph Fritzl imprisoned his daughter in a secret room in his basement for 24 years and fathered 6 to 7 children on her. The Franklin Expedition. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 British sailors and military personnel on 2 ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic across to the Pacific through Arctic waters. The ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 2 former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdier builds, departed British waters in the 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations, it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did so. The weight of the ships with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons off of worked against them, as much of the waters crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The time chosen to launch the expedition occurred at one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, meaning the polar ice, and, particularly the pack ice, didn't melt like usual as the ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last 4 years thanks to the revolutionary new process of canning, was bought at the lowest bidder. Much of the food was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning, and even the ones that were properly sealed and kept intact were riddled with lead thanks to the soldering used to keep the food inside fresh. In conjunction with the lead pipes in the ships the men would have been drinking out of 4 years meant the entire crews of both ships were slowly being infected with all manner of diseases, namely botulism, scurvy and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, leading to memory loss, heavy paranoia and general mental deterioration. combined with already present tuberculosis, that killed a small number of the crew before departing to the Arctic. After about 2 to 3 years stuck in the ice, the captain in charge of the voyage, John Franklin, and many other crew members died in unknown circumstances, and the remainder decided to abandon ships and try and hike out together to the nearest trading outpost and Backfish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away, by loading up their rowboats with supplies and fixing them on sleds to be pulled. All remaining crew perished on that journey. Their remains discovered by local Inuit/Netsilik tribes, who described desolate campsites of skeleton-like corpses with hazily built, half-open tents and even human body parts in cook pots, heavy implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. My maternal grandfather, in the days before hot water on tap, put a big pot on to boil before leaving for work for his wife and kids to bathe with. The pot boiled over and extinguished the flame. He returned to find them dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. My mother was of his second marriage. I'm not sure what the entire story is, but there was a body discovered somewhere in Siberia. His cause of death was freezing, but something was off. Turns out, he had been attacked by a tiger. The tiger used his jaws and grabbed the guy by his backpack, picked him up over his head, and slammed him so hard that it snapped both of his femurs. You'd live 3 days after the attack, crawling around in the snow. Edit. I appreciate the wholesome award, guys. The US West Virginia was a ship damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the ship was attacked, the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside the ship. Turns out that these noises were people. They were trapped in a room to where they couldn't be broken out of it because of the water that would seep in and drown them, and they couldn't be brought out from the top because of the gases that lingered there that were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of these 3 men were found. Other things that remained were empty cans of food and water and a calendar marked from December 7th to December 23rd. This means they were trapped in there for 16 days. They probably kept wondering if they were ever going to make it out, and then had to come to the realization that they might not be saved, and they had the fear of drowning in the tight little compartment of the ship. They had to face the realization that you are going to die, and the psychological torture that goes along with it. Happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17 yo. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend, and she had the house to herself. Went about her business having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying/facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely mid-2000s. I worked in forensic medicine. My boss had to perform an autopsy on a chopped off head that was found by 2 completely traumatized children. The autopsy itself took 7 hours because the person had over 56 different injuries to the head. Tsujijiri, or literally crossroads killing, is a Japanese term for a practice when a samurai, after receiving a new katana or developing a new fighting style or weapon, tests its effectiveness by attacking a human opponent, usually a random defenseless passerby, in many cases during nighttime. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been, being an innocent traveler walking a trail at night, when suddenly an elite swordsman just materializes from the shadows and begins butchering you and your family, just for fun, and he's going to get away with it too because this was during the lawless Sengoku period when samurai were a protected elite class. It's just disturbing to me. Edit. Apparently there is a Japanese historian that argues that the *INTENTIONS* of these killings may not always be for merely testing blades, and that a more common reason might be robbery, but regardless of the circumstances surrounding it, What is known for certain is that innocent passerbys are being slain from the shadows by an untouchable elite class during the Sengoku. Honestly, I don't care their motive. The end result is civilians being dismembered and disemboweled randomly and in the dark of night for lols and or money. The Broken Arrow killings. 2 brothers brutally murdered their entire family. At one point their young, 5 or 6-ish, siblings were hiding in the bathroom when one of the brothers pretended to need their help. Soon as they let him in, he killed them. One of their last words were, "Please, don't kill me, I love you." Horrifying story. A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or two later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. The husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry ECT. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang explaining she was concerned for their welfare as she had had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. The Silent Gibbon twins. 2 sisters who rarely spoke except to each other. They were sent to separate boarding schools to get them to talk to other people, but entered severe catatonia. They were eventually hospitalized and made a pact that, if one of them died, the other must speak and live a normal life. They had a months-long discussion and decided which one should commit suicide. Eventually, one died of heart inflammation. No causes noted on the autopsy. And just moments after the planned time the other spoke. "I'm free at last, liberated, and at last Jennifer has given up her life for me. There was a guy in my town who stalked women at the furniture store. He would watch women pick out new chairs and he would just linger there and drop these strange comments. That chair would look nice in my den." Then one night he followed one of the women home. He sneaked into their living room and then wait for them to enter the room. He'd then jump out and surprise them. He'd yell, "I knew you took my chair." And he'd scream and chase them. This happened over the course of 5 years. The local police never did anything because he was brothers with the sheriff. Women couldn't buy furniture by themselves. They had to start bringing chaperones. A guy I was good friends with had a party one night and called me to invite me over. It was me and my wife's first day off together in a while, and our daughter was 2 years old. I mentioned it to my wife and my daughter said, "No, don't go daddy." Of course I can't resist that, so I stayed home and we had a good night. My friend, however, had the worst night of his life. His party was going good and everything was fine, even though there was a friend of a friend there who no one really knew. Turns out the stranger had been smoking PCP and decided to start killing people. He took a butcher knife and slashed 3 people's throats. My friend's wife threw their kids out of a 2-story window and jumped out herself, took them into the woods, and called the police. All 3 people died. The police found the guy walking down the side of the road covered in blood and incoherent. He had no idea what he just did. So he said, "What really pisses me off is he was such a good guy. He was a big biker looking teddy bear. Was never an asshole to anyone, and always did what was the right thing. Worked together and hit it off from day one. Always ready with a joke and smile. Maybe not going saved my life, or maybe I could have helped. That weighs on me even 20 years later. The fact that some little pose destroyed the lives of 3 good families that he didn't even know really pisses me off, and I hope he rots in prison and gets his ass kicked every day. Riplane. You were a good man." Edit. My friend was one of the 3 murdered that night. Sorry I wasn't specific about that. I may have had a few beers. The Ariel Castro kidnappings. Basically, a man living in Cleveland, Ohio, kidnapped 3 young girls named Ginny Jesus, Amanda Berry and Michelle Knight, and kept them prisoner in his home in Tremont for 12 years. He even had a child with one, but more often than not, if one got pregnant, He would just beat them until they miscarried. Eventually, one escaped with the help of a man named Charles Ramsey who contacted police. Castro was then arrested, and the other 2 girls were saved. If that's not bad enough, the mother of Jesus went on a talk show with semi-renowned and infamous psychic Sylvia Brown, who told her that her daughter had died in Japan after being sold into sex slavery by Vietnamese human traffickers. Edit 1, change 2 to 12, typo. Edit 2, the names of the girls were added. Edit 3.1, extra details added. Edit 3.2, even more details added. A woman 2 blocks away from my house had multiple children and was pregnant again. I heard my mom talking about her. She has more kids than me, and she about to have another? She's crazy. Mom had 6 of us. One day the lady wasn't pregnant anymore, and there was no baby to be found. Someone told the police about it. The police questioned them and raided their home. They found the newborn dead and stuffed in the freezer. The blue ring octopus has a venom that causes paralysis, causing people to die of cardiac arrest or because of hypoxia. There's no antidote. The cure is CPR or life support for the hour or so it takes for the venom to leave the body. There's a man who was bitten by a blue ring octopus. As the lifeguard was performing CPR, he was lying on his back on the beach, facing the sky, eyes frozen open. Unable to close his eyes or communicate with the others, he lied there as the sun slowly burnt out his retinas. He became permanently blind. This was posted here the last time. The story is about a woman who was found pushing her baby had been dead on a swing for 2 days. The baby died from hypothermia and dehydration. She was found not criminally negligent due to schizophrenia. Here is the article. Absolutely horrifying. One day, this kid gets taken to school by his stepmom for a big science fair. Things go well. He has his picture taken. Stepmom watches him go down the hallway to class, and he's never seen again. The Rape of Nanking. You can watch the documentary on Amazon. It's some of the most brutal attacks upon men, women, children, and the elderly that I've heard. It's heartbreaking. Soldiers would stick something up a woman's vagina to see how far it would go in. They would rape elderly women and children. They would sometimes let the prettier ones live. One soldier raped an 8-year-old girl in the street. There wasn't anything they could do but watch. I can't imagine the absolute pain and agony those poor people went through. HG, the lone survivor of what would later be called the Wichita Massacre. She was a 25-year-old elementary school teacher at the time, and had gone to the triplex where her boyfriend, Jason Beaufort, a science teacher, lived with 2 roommates, Brad Haker, a chemist, and Aaron Sander, who was studying to become a priest. HG settled in front of the TV and began grading papers when Heather Mueller, a friend of Aaron Sanders, showed up. The 5 friends watched TV and eventually retired to their various bedrooms. HG was woken from her sleep shortly after by loud voices and the bedroom door being kicked open. The 2 perps eventually gathered all of the persons in the residence and herded them to the bedroom and ordered them, at gunpoint, to strip. Many atrocities occurred as hours went by, but in the end HG, after being shot in the head in a frozen soccer field, ran naked for almost a mile to find a house with Christmas lights. It was mid-December, to beg for assistance. The story that inspired Candyman is pretty creepy. A woman in a Chicago apartment was murdered by some drug dealer who lived next door. How did he get into her apartment? Through a hole behind her bathroom cabinet/mirror. The Dnipropetrovsk maniacs. A group of 3 teenagers in Ukraine started out committing petty robbery. They moved on to torturing animals. Not long after that, they just started murdering strangers. They killed a bunch of people by bashing the asterisk out of them with household tools for no reason. Knowing there are people like that in the world is terrifying. People who will just murder complete strangers just for their own entertainment. Edit, added a missing word. Edit #2, yes, it's the 3 guys 1 hammer. I was avoiding that detail because I didn't want to encourage people looking for it, but so many people are asking that question that it seems like I have no choice. I read a story recently about Paulette Gerber of Ferrera, a 4-year-old child who went missing from her room in 2010. Her parents immediately notified authorities and started a social media campaign to find Paulette. Paulette's room was searched multiple times and used by her parents to do media interviews. Here's the terrifying part. Paulette was found dead 10 days later. In her bed. She had wedged herself between the mattress and the footboard and suffocated. Here is her bed before they found her. It's insane looking at that picture and knowing she is there and no one had found her. Here is an article for anyone interested. Edit fixed link. Marine biologists attached a tag to a 9-foot-long great white shark. The device measured temperature and depth to monitor the shark's movements. The tag was later found washed up on a beach. Its data showed that 4 months after it was attached, the female great white abruptly dove to a depth of 1,903 feet, 580 meters. The ambient temperature surrounding the tag spiked from 46°F to 78°F, 8°C to 26°C. The data suggested an attack. So this tracker, attached to a great white asterisk, was pulled down rapidly and measured *HIGHER* temperatures consistent with some animals *INTERNAL* body temperature. One theory was that the culprit was *KNOTHER* great white. Won't rule out Cthulhu though. Well, this is scary in a weird personal way, but here goes. My grandfather was hit in the lung pretty bad by a sniper in WW2. The bullet would have hit him right in his heart, but at the last second he hunched a little bit to light a cigarette. So, if my grandfather wasn't a smoker, I probably wouldn't exist right now. What radiation poisoning does to you if you're not lucky enough to die quickly? The worst case that I can think of outside of the Chernobyl incident was the case of Hisashiaochi, a Japanese plant worker who was exposed to fatal amounts of radiation, but thanks to his family and the doctors he was kept alive against his will for 83 goddamn days. A week into the hospital he said, "I can't take it anymore. I'm not a guinea pig." Yet the doctors continued on. When he died, all of his skin had fallen off, all of the skin grafts had fallen off, he'd lost multiple limbs, and he was suffering heart attacks multiple times a day. There are pictures of him on his hospital bed that, if you've been around the internet long enough, you'll know as part of the original Shocking Images collection. It looks like it came straight out of a torture porn movie. I sometimes work on the grounds of a nuclear power plant, and always said that, if the worst happened, and I was exposed to a lethal amount of radiation, that I would just kill myself, rather than suffer something like that. The survival story of Mary Vincent. Picked up as a hitchhiker, Mary was driven out to the middle of nowhere, raped, and left for dead, but not before her attacker chopped both her arms off above the elbow, and tossed her over the side of the road, and down a ditch. She crawled back up, and onto a pitch black desert road, and followed the sound of the highway, to try and get help. Nude, dirty, bloody, and missing both arms, she was picked up, and rescued by a couple on their honeymoon. I'd link an article, but you need to hear it from the mouth of Karen Kilgariff. I grew up on a farm in the Texas Panhandle, the boxy part on top. In a house a few miles from ours, most of the members of a family were randomly murdered. One girl, 10 years old at the time, survived by pretending to be dead. A few years ago, a dude dressed as a clown came to a camp I went to. Apparently he broke into the cabin I was staying in, and stole stuff from some people in my cabin. He took primarily cash and a phone that kids had on them. I saw him there, but I was so young I didn't think much of it. Apparently they couldn't find him because of the gloves he wore and his full body costume. All of the kids had their stuff replaced, but the craziest part is a few of us heard a scream that could not have come from a grown man, that came from the road. The dude was weird, and it was terrifying as an 11-year-old. Someone close to me suffers from schizophrenia, and the voices convinced them that they would chop up their so-and child they didn't have one, and should end their life. They tried to do that, and thankfully their so got home early to see smoke bellowing from the kitchen. Both of them were safe. That's how the so found out that they had schizophrenia. We got them all the help they could, and they are doing a lot better now. I know, not scary, but it was sure as hell one heart attack inducing moment for us. Explorers like a century or two ago went to look about the Arctic, but had their supplies accidentally destroyed and soon, they all ran out. They hunted a polar bear, and ate the insides of it. At the time, knew about how deathly a polar bear's liver was. Because of the high amounts of vitamin A, which can be bad for skin too. Toxicity made him and his crew deathly ill, and when one of them felt that their foot was wet, he took it out, and the lining of his skin came off with the boot. True story. TLDR, explorers killed a polar bear, ate its liver, X-Men under the effects of vitamin A, skin loss and toxicity, and most probably died. Years ago I was reading the local paper that had a "This Day in History" section. I don't remember if it occurred after the First World War or the Second, though I'm thinking it was the first. A former serviceman and his wife were having their 6th child. While she was in the hospital giving birth, he took the first 5 children to the local quarry where he killed them and then committed suicide. Found some info. I found this just now, and it ended up being WWII and not WWI like I thought. Though I didn't remember reading the husband's age at the time, it was older than what I presumed, and they all died at the same time, since he drove the car into the pit. The 14th of June 1945, Pioneer, murder/suicide. Mary Jane, Earl, Asmay, Betty Lau, Alva Stoner by their father, Alfred Stoner, age 38, just gotten back from WWII. Drove himself and kids into gravel pit as a Pioneer, while wife was in hospital giving birth to baby 6. Over 1,000 people showed up to watch the search for the bodies. I also searched on Find a Grave and the mom died in 2010, and only living child, the newborn, passed away in 1993, long before her own mother. If Find a Grave is correct, the mom never remarried. My brother was a police officer. He had a call to check on the welfare of a mother who had not showed up for work. She had died on the sofa and her little toddler brought a little diaper pad and laid down next to her and died of dehydration. The little kid had opened the lower cabinets and drawers in the kitchen looking for food. He still cries about it. He's not the crying kind. Removed. This isn't a scary story, but it's spooky and always captured my imagination. One day a bunch of, I think they were police in training, explored some of the catacombs under Paris. A lot of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. They continued going and saw there were speakers mounted on the wall, playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras. They continued. They came into this huge opening and found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated. It had projectors and a mix of old and new movies. It even had electricity running and 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day they returned to try and investigate further with more experienced officers. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out, all the furniture was gone. All that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who was there. Edited to correct some mistakes. This one kid back in the early 20th century named Bobby Dunbar. He went missing. After like a year of searching for him, his parents came across a man with a kid who looked a lot like Bobby. They believed it was their kid, and after a legal battle with the kid's supposed mother, they brought the kid home. A wild-ass parade happened due to the missing kid's return. He lived and died believing he was, in fact, Bobby Dunbar. Well, a few decades later, his granddaughter asked Bobby's nephew, I think, for a DNA sample, so she could see if her and Bobby's nephew were related. Turns out, they weren't. Meaning the real Bobby Dunbar is still missing, and probably died alone without his parents. When I was 7 I was raking rocks in my aunt's front yard and a beat-up pickup truck pulled up. The man got out, fiddled with something under the hood, and then closed it. He asked me, "Hey kid, do you know how to pop a clutch?" Spending my childhood on a farm, I'd indeed know how. "Yes," I responded. "Give me a hand real quick," he said. so I started walking towards his truck. At the last second my mom called out to me from the garage, and I turned around to see what she wanted. I heard the door slam, truck start, and he drove away. That memory never really came up until one day, about 30 years later. I jump up after laying down to go to bed when out of nowhere it came back and it hit me. This guy was trying to kidnap me. What the asterisk asterisk asterisk. What bullet did I dodge? I mean, you ever have a memory come back and you get scared? I mean, scared over the memory? I was shaking for at least a half hour over it. It still freaks me out thinking about it. I used to work at a cave. It was a tourist attraction. Very busy place. The tour guides used to tell people all the different ways that people died in the cave. This script was changed in the late 90s to make the tour more G-rated. But needless to say, all of us employees still know how many people had died there since the 1890s. It was always one of those things that we joked about amongst us. Anyways, one evening after closing, some of the tour guides were messing with a brand new tour guide and told her to go sweep the cave. Remember, this is a cave, so I thought this was the practical joke. Nope. They told her to make sure she got back in an area that was quite a ways back from the entrance. Once they saw she was back there, they started swinging the extremely large, thick, bank vault-like door shut. They managed to get it shut while she was still making a beeline for the entrance. They then turned off the cave lights from the outside. I told the guys to let her out quick and not prolong the torture. We all heard the faint screaming and banging on the vault. And then it stopped. We all quickly rushed to get the door open. Flipped the lights on, but he wasn't anywhere to be seen. She was tucked away behind a corner, quite a ways away from the entrance. Farther than we thought she could make it in the dark. She was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth with her arms wrapped around her knees, hyperventilating. After we got her somewhat calmed down, all she said was, "Someone grabbed me." She was never the same after that night. She was a bubbly, outgoing person before, and a quiet, standoffish person after. We could never get her to talk more about it, and she quit soon after. Edit. I wanted to add that I was not really part of the prank. I was a young high school kid and had dealt with 10 plus years of bullying. The college guys pulling the prank were older, stronger, and more aggressive, and it made me retract into my shell like I did with my school bullies. I tried speaking up, but was afraid that I'd be attacked as well. I'm not proud of it, but bullying makes kids handle life in some pretty awful ways. I think about it a lot and often kick myself for not standing up more, but I have also tried to forgive myself. Junko Furuta's murderers should be in prison for the rest of their lives. How any of them are walking scot-free is incomprehensible to me. Addend, y'all, I was literally just thinking of the first one that came to mind, but I'm also glad to have provoked an enriching discussion about what humanity and human decency really are. God knows I hope the killers get justice, yet, and if they don't, I have no doubt God has Junko Furuta in his eternal rest, at least. As for the killers, they are not going to be glad to meet God at all, I imagine, because he alone knows the full extent of what they did, and they will see justice regardless. Addend #2, I'm trying to reply to every comment, but may not get to all of them, as my inbox is flooded with replies presently. I will do my best. The war crimes that Unit 731, Japanese, have done, including but not limited to dissecting Chinese and Koreans' children alive, or vivisection, raping babies, syphilis and frostbite testing on Chinese, steaming Chinese alive, etc. (bracket). The data that 78% of human body is made of water is partially a result of the 731 drying experiment, where Japanese scientists roasted Chinese civilians to death in a high temperature room for 15 hours, then weighed the dried mummy body and compare it with the victim's body weight before the experiment. A story I heard from my grandpa is that they lured orphans with food because Chinese were starving during the long-lasting WW2. Tricked them saying the injections were vaccines against flu, while it's actually full of Steve virus. then observed them slowly dying in agony, but continuously supplying them basic nutritions, so they would last for as long as possible. The Nanjing Massacre is just a cornerstone of the terrible war crimes conducted by the Japanese Imperial armies, where half of the population from one of the most developed cities in China at the time were just wiped out in 10 days. Bodies were burnt for months. The world history has never witnessed such a cliff drop in population. The Imperial Japan did not consider Chinese, Koreans or Indonesians as humans. They're referring to them as monkeys and logs. Even the Auschwitz camp is acknowledged, but Unit 731 and the terrible biological warfares have never been acknowledged by Japanese up till today, not mention apologies, even though there are evidences and memorials everywhere all over Asia. My grandpa always says history is written by the winners, but these horrible things really happened. He remembers his parents being killed in front of his eyes by the Japanese. People remember everything to do with Haj Mohammed Masfuhi. He was a shoemaker who lived in Morocco in the late 19th and early 20th century. He and his accomplice, a 70-year-old woman called Niace, used to drug and kill young women who came to the shop. Eventually one of the victim's parents traced her movements to the shop, and after the remains of 36 mutilated corpses were discovered nearby, Masfuhi and Niace were questioned and tortured. I didn't survive, but Masfuhi confessed to murdering them, usually for a tiny amount of money. His initial sentence was crucifixion, a very unusual punishment even then. However, there were many protests from powerful foreign embassies, and Morocco couldn't do much against them. Instead he was sentenced to beheading, a more common punishment. However, the mood in Marrakech was that this was far too lenient, so they settled on immurement, being walled up alive. A special cell was constructed in the wall of the bazaar, about 2x 6 feet. Chains were attached to one wall to ensure he would be kept standing. Masfuhi wasn't told of his fate until the morning of his execution, when he was led, screaming, in chains and slowly bricked up inside. Once the last course had been laid, the crowd would fall silent until he started screaming, when they would cheer. He screamed nearly constantly for 2 days. On the third day he fell silent. The story about the entire town in Iran that was buried under such an intense snowstorm, it smothered 4,000 people. Also, that molasses flood that drowned a bunch of people, are like the story of terror, the man who ate everything. Whilst in hospital he was accused of eating offal from the bins and a toddler went missing, for which he was also blamed. He ate puppies and lizards. He ate a banquet for 6 on his own. He had very stretchy skin that would glow and sweat profusely after eating. He had frequent exudative diarrhea and an odor emanated from him which could still be smelled from a distance. He was shunned by society. A good explanation of his very interesting story, including his very short time as a spy, can be found on Wikipedia. A woman my mom is friends with came home to find her entire family brutally murdered. Her parents, grandparents, and both her older siblings, plus her baby sister. She grabbed her younger brother and ran to the neighbor's house. The police arrived. It turns out her oldest brother killed them all and was waiting on his sister and brother to come home to kill them too. The only thing that saved her life is that she stopped before she went upstairs, which is where he was lying in wait with an axe. To this day, every 3 years she has to bring all of his letters, where he is still threatening to kill them, to the parole board to prevent his release. Story number 2 ***. My cousin's neighbor came over to visit and was acting off. First, her house was 3 miles away, on a dirt road, and she had walked over in the middle of hot summer. This wasn't normal for her. She was jittery and kept mentioning that she hadn't heard from her husband all day and was afraid to go home. My cousin's mom came in the room and pulled my cousin to the side and told her to keep the neighbor talking. She's calling the police. Cousin's mom had noticed a chunk of what looked like hamburger meat on the woman's dress and thought that she might be in some kind of shock and that something might be wrong at home. The police arrive and take her outside. She continues to be jittery and not making a lot of sense. They check her house. They find her husband's recliner soaked in blood, with a trail leading up the stairs. On stairs they find fingers. At the top of the stairs, in the bedroom, they find her husband dead. She had killed him with a butcher knife because he was taking up too much of her time. As she left, he wasn't dead yet and had started up the stairs to get to the phone. She attacked him again and cut off several fingers. He went still and she believed he was dead and took off. He almost made it to the phone. I grew up in a funeral home. I helped out in the office. When I was about 15, we got a call from a man whose wife and infant baby had been murdered in cold blood. There were very few clues. It made headlines. Cops set up surveillance at the viewing. It was heartbreaking, as the mother was holding the baby in her arms. I was asked to take the flower cards and periodically get the husband and ask if he recognized the names. I then photocopied them and put them back. I did, because I was the kid, people knew me, and I was unobtrusive. I talked to the husband quite a bit. He seemed devastated and shaken. The cops told me they had an eyewitness to someone leaving the house the day of the murder. The witness was a 3-year-old girl. She recognized the man leaving. It was the husband's best friend. Turns out that the friend and the husband had made a pact to kill each other's families and run off with their secretaries. The little girl identified the friend, and I guess one of them cracked. They both went to jail on multiple counts, all on the testimony of a 3-year-old. I still cannot believe to this day that that man stood right beside me, multiple times, and I had no clue. I don't think I ever looked at life the same way after that. Edit. Thanks for the awards, but the wholesome award? Lol. Chicago Tylenol murders. The Chicago Tylenol murders were a series of poisoning deaths resulting from drug tampering in the Chicago metropolitan area in 1982. The victims had all taken Tylenol branded acetaminophen capsules that had been laced with potassium cyanide. A total of 7 people died in the original poisonings, several more deaths in subsequent copycat crimes. No suspect was ever charged or convicted of the poisonings. Incidents led to reforms in the packaging of over-the-counter substances and to federal anti-tampering laws. The actions of Johnson & Johnson to reduce deaths and warn the public of poisoning risks have been widely praised as an exemplary public relations response to such a crisis. Just heard today from my mom for the first time. My grandma grew up on a farm. She was over at a friend's for the night, and as they were getting in bed, the other girl said, "Oh, we forgot to check the pasture gate." They got out there, and my gran says we locked this. Friend's almost casual response. I know, there's man under the bed. It wasn't uncommon for drifters to show up places like that, and so was what they were taught to do. Story of Aruna Schanborg. She spent 42 years of her life in a vegetative state after she was raped by a sweeper of the hospital where she worked as a nurse. What's more scary is the fact that the culprit never got punished and still roams freely. My father used to work as a medical examiner. He was the guy they sent when a crime scene contained a dead person to give a preliminary examination of the corpse before it got sent off for more rigorous investigation. One of his worst stories was being called in for a child, around 9 or 10, that had ostensibly been killed in a drive-by shooting while he and his older brother were playing in the front yard. When my dad examined the corpse, however, the presence of gunpowder burns across his face indicated the shot must have been point blank. His older brother had lied about the shooting. He'd shot him himself. Murder of Sylvia Likens. The parents of Sylvia Likens left her with her carriage driver. The carriage driver used her sister as a coercive threat, and along with her children and their friends tortured and killed her. This true story was also made into a 2007 movie, The Girl Next Door, which was based on the 1989 novel, The Girl Next Door, The Abduction of J.C. Lee Duguid. Kidnapped when she was 11 at her bus stop while her stepfather watched in horror by a paroled sex offender and his wife. She was held captive for 18 years until found in 2009. He was *SUPPOSED* to be spending 50 years in prison for the kidnap and rape of a woman, but only served 10 when he abducted JC in 1991. JC bore his children, 2 daughters while in captivity and they knew her as their older sister the entire time. The good news is, JC and her daughters were reunited with her mother and are doing well. Edit. Tomorrow, June 10th, 2021 is actually the 30th year anniversary of her kidnapping. Crazy. One of my best friends growing up had an aunt that was the sweetest, most generous woman you could possibly know. She started dating a man that fell in love with her because of how sweet and kind she was. After a month or so of being together, he accused her of being too nice to other people, so he bludgeoned her until she was unconscious and cut her heart out of her chest while she was still alive. He thought that it was the worst example of sheer disrespect that she would exhibit kindness towards other people when she was in a committed relationship. He believed he owned all of the good she had to give, and by being nice to people that weren't him, she may as well have been cheating with the whole town. He killed her for being the person he knew her to be when they started dating. The fact people like him exist is terrifying to me. Niace Case, 2012, Delhi. A female student boarded an off-duty bus with a male friend. They were returning home after watching a film. The 6 men, who were already on board, including the driver, attacked the couple, taking turns to rape the woman in the moving bus around the city, before brutally assaulting her with an iron rod. Her friend was beaten and tied to watch the assault. They were then thrown out onto the roadside to die. Some passers-by found them naked and bloodied and called the police. 2 weeks later, after widespread protests that demanded India reckon with its treatment of women, the victim died in a hospital in Singapore, where she was taken for further treatment after her condition deteriorated in a Delhi hospital. All 6 people were arrested for the attack. One of them was found dead in jail in March 2013, having apparently taken his own life. Another, who was 17 at the time of the attack, was released in 2015 after serving 3 years in a reform facility. The remaining 4 were hanged in the capital's high-security Tehran prison. My great-aunt woke up in the middle of the night. She heard her dog making these low growls. She was single at the time and living alone in her ranch-style home. She walked out to her living room to check things out. She didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary, so she decided to make sure her door and front windows were locked. Door was locked, first window she checked was locked. When she lifted the mini blind on the second window, it was wide open and a guy in a ski mask was standing there. She said he laughed this evil laugh and said party time, then he started to climb in. She screamed that she had a gun. Her dog started barking his head off. The would-be rapist decided to bolt. My aunt did get a gun after that and learned how to use it. I can't even think about what would have happened to her if she didn't have her dog to warn her. In 1983 an accidental large-scale nuclear war almost started by a Soviet satellite malfunction, only stopped by Stanislav Petrov disobeying orders. My soccer coach used to tell us this story whenever we were practicing heading the ball. My coach said he had a player who went out of his way to head the ball as much as possible and got really good at it. But one time the ball hit him square on the top of his head and his tongue was out. The guy ended up biting his own tongue in half. You might think he was just telling a story, but he told it with such seriousness I 100% believe him. Scared me off heading the ball every chance I got. One of my mom's old coworkers was loading stuff into a truck when an older man came over and offered to help. Apparently he was very nice and polite and just left when they were done. Shot the man's name, and when she told her mother, she flipped. Turns out it was Ed Gein, the guy that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based on. He was serving time at the Mendota Mental Institute, right next to where she worked. Like I said before, apparently he was actually a very nice person in his later years, but it's still freaky having a run-in with someone so infamous. Edit, for everyone questioning. He was pretty old at that point and wasn't a threat because he was rehabilitated. Also, if I'm not mistaken, the Mendota Mental Institute has pretty lax rules and isn't the greatest place. That's what I remember from a research project I did on it couple years ago, but I may be wrong. This is a personal story, but I think it does illustrate a greater point. I've told the story before, and I'll try to keep it brief. I used to live and work in South Africa with a charity organization, and while there I became friends with a man originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who were now in SAB working with our group. Eventually I ended up moving back to Canada, but still kept in touch sporadically over Facebook. A couple of years went by, and he stopped updating his profile. It was sad, but people move on, and we were halfway around the world, friendships can fade. However, a couple of years after that I was back in South Africa on holidays, and asked some mutual friends if they knew where he was, so that maybe we could all meet up and catch up on old time. Unfortunately, all they knew was that he had moved away around the time he stopped updating his profile, and no one knew where he ended up. Another friend and I decided to try and track him down. We ended up getting a hold of his family, who were in Kinshasa, DRC. They that he had planned to go to Angola for a job opportunity, but they too had not heard from him in well over a year. Sadly, I couldn't stay and continue on the search, but my other friend did. He found that he did indeed make it to Luanda in Angola, and was heading towards a town called Luo near to the Angola/DRC border. However, this is where the trail went cold, and he disappeared off the face of the earth. No one knows what happened to him. Maybe he fell ill and died and was quickly buried somewhere with no one being informed. Maybe he fell victim to foul play. Maybe in the vast wilderness he got lost or hurt, or whatever. We will never know. We informed his family of what we found, and they were grateful, but they too have reached closure in feeling that he is dead. Unfortunately, that is the fate that could befall many itinerant workers, and in many areas of developing countries, there is few resources or will available to make more than a cursory search, if that. The point is, it is possible for people to disappear even in this day and age. Usually it is the less fortunate, or itinerant people, or those in areas too remote or undeveloped to have proper social safety nets to help them. We rarely think of the possibly until it affects us or someone we know, but it isn't that hard for us or a loved one to go missing, and the ones left behind to never know what happened. And there's a scary thought. My mother works in hospice, which is basically where people are sent to die as comfortably as possible. Cancer patients and elderly galore there. Anyways, the scariest stories I know are when the dying patients basically lose rights to make decisions about their bodies. Sometimes it's because of Alzheimer's or dementia, but that means it's often your kids or your grandkids calling the shots for your health. Well, my mom didn't work in hospice for long, because a lot of kids or grandkids will selfishly keep these people alive for as long as possible. And let me tell you, there's only so much morphine they can give you without killing you, and the body is capable of dishing out a lot of pain that pain meds can't fix. There is also a particularly cruel type of cancer that affects the pain regions of your brain. Really, there is a reason people advocate for compassionate death when one is suffering from terminal illness. Death is natural. Sometimes turning off the machines is the right thing. But when your next of kin feels sad about the idea of you dying, sometimes something that should have taken a few days will be dragged out for years to come. These patients aren't happy or enjoying their last few days. They are suffering. They beg for more painkillers when they've already reached maximum dosage. Sometimes they ask to die, and you can't just let nature take its course. This is literally my worst nightmare. I promised my mother, if she ever gets that sick I won't do that to her, and I'm sticking to my guns. Sometimes they will stop eating in an attempt to die, and then the nurses are forced to stick a tube down their throats to keep them alive. This is, in my opinion, torture. People, don't do this to your elders, please. Don't make them beg for death. The Fritzl Case. A man named Joseph Fritzl, who lived in a small town called Amstetten in Austria, fakes the disappearance of her daughter Elizabeth. In reality, he keeps her captive for 24 years in a hidden room in the basement of his house he had been working in as a nuclear shelter. During this period of time he assaulted his daughter several times, and had several children with her who grew older over time in this room. When one of Elizabeth's children died shortly after being born, he just took the body from her and incinerated it. He also regularly punished them by cutting the electricity or not bringing them food. Joseph wanted to take care of the children with his wife, Elizabeth's mother, who wasn't aware of the events in her basement, so he'd make Elizabeth write fake letters, and then he would pretend he found the babies in their porch. In 2008, when one of Elizabeth's oldest daughter Kirsten fell sick, Joseph sent her to a hospital. After a long talk, Joff let Elizabeth go see her daughter at the hospital. The police catched them in the hospital and interrogated them. Elizabeth told them her long and horrifying story, but no before she could make them promise she would never have to see her father again. Here's a Wikipedia article about it. 2 other stories would be the Piggy Palace Massacre or the case of Robert Hansen. German Wings Flight 9525, Wikipedia. The co-pilot locked himself in the cockpit and set the airplane for a slow descent into the French Alps. For 10 minutes, the crew desperately tried to get back into the cockpit, but in this post-9/11 world, the door was designed to withstand assault did not fail. This was a daytime flight. Passengers knew what was happening. They could see the mountains getting closer out the windows. This wasn't a quick, "What's that? OMG, out." This is a long, drawn-out realization of what was coming, and the end was inevitable. Chilling. Honestly, I'm not sure anything makes me feel as much terror as stuff like the recent road rage murder of Aiden Leos. To think that one moment you're driving down the road, and the next, your innocent little baby is bleeding to death in your arms. Your sweet 6-year-old child dies terrified and in pain, and there's absolutely nothing you can do help, and nothing you could have done to prevent it. All because some inhuman scum-sucking sack of piss was annoyed with the way you were driving. Ever since I read about this story, my anxiety has been through the roof. I can't stop thinking about the hell that his poor mother is living every day. I wish I believed in hell, so I could feel like those responsible will go there, because there is truly no punishment on this earth that is enough to give those monsters what they deserve. Edit, I forgot to add, it's particularly scary, because I feel like I'm seeing these kinds of stories constantly, about innocent people being murdered by road rage monsters. Not long ago I read about a couple who got left out on the Great Barrier Reef during a diving tour because of crappy business practices. They were never found, but they found a piece of something, can't remember what it was, that had something like, "Save us before we die" scrawled on it. Not as bad as most of what's here, but an interesting deep sea study was conducted last year that has some frightening implications. Marine biologists took 3 alligator carcasses and dropped them 6,600 feet into the Gulf of Mexico. This is deep enough that there is no natural light, therefore no plants. Without plants, the ecosystem must sustain itself on marine snow, which is usually scraps of dead animals that were partially eaten nearer to the surface, but the less desirable pieces weren't touched and sank. The ecosystem this deep is basically all scavengers, with a few small predators. The first of the 3 gators was fully consumed after less than 24 hours by giant amphipods, large deep-sea invertebrates the size of a grapefruit. The second was consumed more slowly. After 51 days only bones were left. Interestingly, a new species of bone-eating worm was found on the remains. The third carcass is the one that gives me chills. When scientists sent their probe down to look at it, it was gone. Not a trace. There were drag marks on the seabed and the ropes used to hold it in place had been torn apart, but other than that, it was gone. In waters this deep, most animals are the size of a cat or smaller. They stay small because food is so scarce. Be big enough to tear through rope, pick up an 80-pound gator, and leave with it. Whoever took it must have been an order of magnitude larger than anything that lives that deep. It's possible it was a shark, but sharks of the estimated size required don't often live so deep. We still don't know what took that gator. Edit, there's been a lot of discussion in the comments about different possible culprits. Well, it's impossible to say for sure. The most likely species is the Six Gill Shark, one of the handful of truly large species that lives this deep. Our possible options include the Greenland shark and Magna pinna squid. James Bulger. He was just 2 years old, and with his mom running errands. She let go of his hand to pay the cashier, and he wandered away. Two 10-year-old boys spotted him, lured him toward them, took him by the hands, and led him away. He took him to a remote location, pushing and kicking at him the whole time. Some people questioned the two kids with the crying toddler, but they lied saying he was their brother and nobody intervened further. They took him to a secluded spot and tortured him. I don't want to recount the torture details, it's just too gruesome. They left his body on some railroad tracks hoping that being run over by a train would make it look like an accident. He was found days later, his body severed in half by a train. Boys were caught and became the youngest convicted murderers in British history. Security footage from the day they took James shows them watching children picking out a target. And they were just kids themselves. They were released at 18. One of them is back in jail for possessing child abuse photos on his computer. The most terrifying thing about this for me is that my own son is only 2 now, and James's murderers were just children too. It was premeditated and intentional and entirely random. Just a moment to relapse in attention and he became a target of 2 murderous children *children*. To think that children younger than my stepson are capable of such a thing. Ugh. Everything about this case is just horrifying. I would have hated to be at the Battle of Verdun. Here's a collection of survivor stories that give you an idea of how horrible it was. Just a few. I have returned from the most terrible ordeal I have ever witnessed. 4 days and 4 nights, 96 hours, the last 2 days in ice cold mud, kept under relentless fire, without any protection whatsoever except for the narrow trench, which even seemed to be too wide. I arrived with 175 men. I returned with 34. Of whom several had half turned insane. One soldier was going insane with thirst, and drank from a pond covered with a greenish Lernial Dead Man's Hill. A corpse was afloat in it, his black countenance face down in the water and his abdomen swollen, as if he had been filling himself up with water for days now. We all carried the smell of dead bodies with us. The bread we ate, the stagnant water we drank, everything we touched smelled of decomposition due to the fact that the earth surrounding us was packed with dead bodies. Everyone who searches for cover in a shell hole stumbles across slippery, decomposing bodies and has to proceed with smelly hands and smelly clothes. Even though this is a common topic, I always upvote them because these are my favorite types of threads. The New London school explosion. A school in Texas in 1937 tried to tap into natural gas on their own, and it ended up leaking and blowing up the school. It's the reason they make natural gas scented in Texas, and probably the US now. I'm amazed I never heard of this in school, because it seems like something that should be taught. I read some survivor stories, and I had **** nightmares. It was horrible. 3 in particular stuck with me. One was a 7 or 8-year-old girl. She saw her best friend and playmate with her entire body crushed by concrete with only her shoulders and head above it, and she still had a lollipop in her mouth, like she didn't know what happened. Another was a guy, I think a 16 to 17-year-old, helping and dig people and bring them out of the wreckage. He saw a dad holding his daughter crying his eyes out while the back of the girl's head was broken open with her brain on the ground next to her. The last was a 9-ish-year-old girl who went to find her mom after it happened. There was a PTA meeting going on at the time, so there was a lot of parents at the scene. Her mom was freaking out trying to find her, but didn't even recognize her. She went up to her mom and called out to her, but she just kept saying, "You're not my daughter." She's so covered in blood and ash and tears that her own mother couldn't recognize her. It was a truly horrifying thing. My dad worked in a morgue during college in the 60s. One time on the night shift he was training a recent hire who was wheeling a body down the hallway. The body was under a sheet but all of a sudden started to sit up. The guy immediately freaked out and out the doors and quit. Apparently a dead body can have muscle contractions in the abs causing it to start sitting up. The more you know, I guess.